The slate lay cracked beneath the hemlock, chalk dust mingling with morning frost. 23 children had filed into these Kentucky hills behind Miss Clara Whitmore on October 15, 1883, their lunch pails gleaming in dappled sunlight. By noon, 23 children emerged from the tree line alone. They spoke in whispers of how the teacher had stopped mid-lesson, how her eyes had fixed on something deeper in the woods that none of them could see, how she had set down her primer and walked into the shadows between the trees, never looking back. The children waited until the sun began to sink, then gathered their slates and returned to the hollow. When the fathers came with lanterns and rifles, they found no trace of Clara Whitmore, no torn fabric, no disturbed earth, no cry for help echoing from the ridges, just the cracked slate and a story that would haunt Pine Creek Hollow for generations. The letter arrived at the Pine Creek Post Office on September 28, 1883, bearing the seal of the Kentucky Department of Education. Postmaster Jeremiah Cobb held the envelope to the lamplight, squinting at the careful script that spelled out Pine Creek Hollow School District. There was no school district. There was barely a hollow. 300 souls scratched out their existence in the shadow of Cumberland Ridge, where the morning mist clung to cabin chimneys and the sound of axes rang through valleys that had never known a church bell. The men worked timber and coal. The women tended gardens carved from steep hillsides. The children learned what their parents could teach them: how to read the weather in the ridge clouds, how to track game through laurel thickets, how to survive winters that could last until May. The letter spoke of progress, of opportunity, of a young woman from Lexington who had volunteered to bring education to the mountain children. Miss Clara Whitmore would arrive by October 1st, equipped with books, slates, and the authority of the state to establish a proper school. Cobb read the letter aloud to the handful of men who gathered each evening around his pot-bellied stove. They listened in silence, tobacco smoke curling toward the ceiling. "Don't reckon we asked for this," said Thomas Henley, whose sawmill provided the only steady work for 20 miles. "State don't ask," replied Cobb. "State tells." But some of the women had different thoughts. Sarah Mitchum, who had taught her own children their letters from a worn Bible, spoke quietly of the advantages an education might bring. Martha Vale, whose boy showed a quick mind for numbers, wondered aloud if this teacher might open doors beyond the hollow. The men remained skeptical. They had seen government promises before: revenue agents who came to count their stills, land surveyors who mapped their holdings for distant investors, strangers who arrived with papers and left with pieces of their lives. Yet when Clara Whitmore stepped off the supply wagon on October 1st, even the doubters found themselves curious. She was younger than expected, perhaps 25, with dark hair pinned severely beneath a blue bonnet. She carried herself with the straight spine of someone accustomed to being watched, but her eyes held a gentleness that put the children at ease. She had brought more than books. Her trunk contained slate boards, chalk, inkwells, and primers printed in Louisville. She carried letters of recommendation from the superintendent and a mandate to establish regular instruction for any child between the ages of 6 and 16. "I intend to hold classes outdoors when weather permits," she told the gathering of parents in Henley's mill yard. "The children will learn their letters and numbers, certainly, but also geography, natural science, and history. I believe education should prepare them for the world beyond these hills." The world beyond these hills. The phrase settled over the crowd like morning fog, carrying both promise and unease. Martha Vale stepped forward first, her hand on her son's shoulder. "When do we start?" Clara Whitmore chose a clearing beside Pine Creek for her outdoor classroom, where the children could sit on fallen logs arranged in rough rows. The spot offered advantages: water nearby for washing slates, enough open sky for good light, and the steady sound of the creek to mask the occasional distraction of a hawk's cry or a squirrel's chatter. She began with 23 pupils ranging from 6-year-old Mercy Cobb to 16-year-old James Henley, who towered over his teacher but approached his letters with the careful concentration of someone discovering a new language. The children brought their own challenges. Some had never held a pencil. Others could recite scripture but struggled with simple arithmetic. Many spoke the mountain dialect that Clara gently corrected, teaching them what she called proper English. "You must speak clearly," she would say, "so that anyone, anywhere can understand your meaning." The lessons followed a rhythm that Clara had learned in her training college in Lexington. Morning recitation, where each child stood to demonstrate their reading. Arithmetic problems worked out on the large slate she had mounted on a maple tree. Geography lessons that stretched their understanding beyond the ridges they knew, introducing them to oceans and cities and countries that existed only in maps and stories. But it was the natural science lessons that truly captured their attention. Clara had them collect leaves, stones, and insects, teaching them to observe and classify. She spoke of the scientific method, of asking questions and seeking evidence. She encouraged them to wonder about the world around them, rather than simply accepting what they had always been told. "Why do you think the creek runs faster after a storm?" she would ask. "What makes some trees lose their leaves while others stay green all winter?" The children began to see their familiar hollow through new eyes. They started asking questions their parents couldn't answer, using words their grandparents didn't recognize. Some families embraced the change. Sarah Mitchum delighted in her daughter's progress with reading. The Vale children raced home each afternoon to share what they had learned. Young Timothy Cobb began correcting his grandfather's grammar, earning both pride and exasperation from the old postmaster. Others grew uneasy. When 10-year-old Rebecca Sizemore announced that the earth was round and spun around the sun, her father responded with a backhand and a reminder that the good book said otherwise. When Samuel Henley asked his uncle why they couldn't go to the county seat for proper schooling, he was told that city learning would ruin a mountain boy for honest work. Clara sensed the tension but pressed forward. She had signed a contract with the state, and she intended to fulfill it. More than that, she believed in her mission. These children deserved the same opportunities as their counterparts in Lexington or Louisville. They deserved to know that the world was larger than their hollow, and that they could claim a place in it. By mid-October, the classroom had become a stage where two different visions of the future played out daily. The first sign of trouble came on October 10th, when Clara discovered that someone had moved her supplies during the night. Nothing was missing, but her carefully arranged books had been stacked differently, and chalk dust covered items that should have been clean. She mentioned it to no one, but began carrying her most valuable materials back to her boarding room at the Mitchum cabin each evening. 3 days later, the vandalism turned deliberate. Her mounted slate was found cracked down the middle, and someone had scattered her collected specimens across the clearing. When she asked the children if they had seen anything suspicious, they exchanged glances but offered no answers. "Might have been bears," suggested James Henley, though he didn't meet her eyes when he said it. Clara knew it wasn't bears. Bears didn't stack books or break slates with such precision, but she also knew better than to press the children for information that might put them at odds with their families. She repaired what she could and continued teaching. The lessons grew more ambitious as Clara's confidence grew. She introduced the children to poetry, having them memorize verses by Longfellow and Whittier. She taught them songs from beyond the mountains, expanding their musical repertoire beyond the ballads and hymns they knew. She even began basic lessons in Latin, believing that classical education was the foundation of true learning. Some parents appreciated their children's expanding knowledge. Others saw it as dangerous presumption. "She's filling their heads with foolishness," muttered Ezra Sizemore at the post office gathering. "Teaching them to be ashamed of their raising. Teaching them to think," countered Dr. William Frost, the circuit physician who stopped by the Hollow once a month. "Nothing wrong with that." "Thinking's fine," said Thomas Henley. "Thinking they're better than their people ain't." The debate might have remained philosophical if not for the incident with Mary Cobb. The postmaster's youngest daughter, 8 years old and bright as a new penny, came home from school on October 12th with questions about slavery. Clara had been teaching them about the recent war, explaining how it had changed the country and freed the enslaved people of the South. "Were we the bad ones, Grandpappy?" Mary asked her grandfather that evening. "Miss Clara says the South fought to keep people in chains." Jeremiah Cobb felt the words like a physical blow. He had served with the 35th Kentucky Infantry, had seen friends die at Stones River and Chickamauga. The war had been about many things, but in his mind, it had mostly been about surviving long enough to come home to his mountains. That night, he visited Thomas Henley. "This has gone far enough," Cobb said. "She's turning our children against us." Henley poured coffee and listened as Cobb described his granddaughter's questions. Other men arrived as word spread. Ezra Sizemore, whose daughter had stopped helping with evening chores because she needed time for her studies. Jacob Vale, whose son had announced his intention to seek further schooling in the county seat. Aaron Mitchum, despite his wife's support for the teacher. They talked until nearly midnight, voices growing harder as the grievances accumulated. Clara Whitmore was changing their children, certainly. The question was whether that change served the Hollow's interests or threatened them. "What do you propose we do?" asked Dr. Frost, who had stayed to listen. The men looked at each other across the lamplight. None wanted to admit what they were considering. Thomas Henley knocked on the door of the Mitchum cabin at 7:30 a.m. on October 13th, his hat in his hands and his face carrying the weight of a difficult conversation. Behind him stood Jeremiah Cobb and Ezra Sizemore, forming what they had decided to call a parents' delegation. Sarah Mitchum invited them in for coffee, though the tension in her kitchen could have been cut with a hay knife. Clara sat at the small table, her lesson plans spread before her, trying to project calm authority while her stomach knotted. "Miss Whitmore," Henley began, settling his considerable frame into the chair across from her. "We appreciate what you're trying to do for our children. We surely do. But some concerns have been raised." Clara set down her pen and folded her hands. She had expected this conversation since the vandalism began. "What concerns?" "Well," Cobb cleared his throat, "it seems like you might be pushing a bit hard, moving a bit fast. These children have never had formal schooling before." "They're remarkably quick learners," Clara replied. "I've been impressed by their intelligence and curiosity." "That's just it," said Sizemore. "You've got them asking questions that maybe don't need asking, stirring up thoughts that maybe ought to stay settled." Clara felt heat rise in her cheeks, but kept her voice level. "What specific concerns do you have with the curriculum?" The men exchanged glances. Henley took the lead. "The war history, for one. These mountains lost good men in that fight. Families are still healing from those wounds. Maybe that's not the best place to start a child's education. History helps us understand the present, Clara said. The children should know about the events that shaped their country. Should they know their grandfathers were fighting for evil? Cobb's voice carried an edge. Should they come home thinking their people were on the wrong side? They should understand that complex issues have complex causes, Clara replied. I'm not teaching them to judge their families. I'm teaching them to think critically about difficult subjects. Sarah Mitchum refilled coffee cups, her movements careful and deliberate. Aaron Mitchum stood by the window, saying nothing but listening to every word. There's also the matter of expectations, Henley continued. You're teaching these children about places and opportunities that don't exist for mountain people. You're giving them ideas about college and city life that can only lead to disappointment. Or to achievement, Clara countered. Some of these children have exceptional potential. James could study engineering. Mary has a natural gift for languages. Timothy shows real aptitude for mathematics. Why should they be limited by geography? Because geography is what we have, Sizemore said bluntly. This hollow needs its children. The farms need workers. The mill needs hands. If you send our brightest away to the cities, what's left for us? Clara stood and walked to the window, looking out at the mist rising from Pine Creek. She had encountered this argument before, in her training and in her previous teaching position in a small town near Frankfurt. It always came down to the same conflict: individual opportunity versus community continuity. I'm not trying to empty your hollow, she said finally. I'm trying to give your children choices. Some will choose to stay and will bring new knowledge to their traditional work. Others may choose different paths, but that should be their decision to make. Made with what understanding? Henley asked. You've been here 2 weeks. You don't know what life is like through a mountain winter. You don't know what it means to lose a harvest or have the mill close for a season. You're teaching them to want things you can't deliver. The accusation stung because it contained truth. Clara had come to the hollow with genuine intentions but limited understanding. She had read about rural education but had never lived the realities these families faced daily. Then teach me, she said, turning back to face the men. Help me understand what these children need to know to thrive here. But don't ask me to limit their education because you're afraid they might leave. Aaron Mitchum finally spoke from his position by the window. What are you afraid they might find if they stay? Thomas Henley knocked on the door of the Mitchum cabin at 7:30 a.m. on October 13th, his hat in his hands and his face carrying the weight of a difficult conversation. Behind him stood Jeremiah Cobb and Ezra Sizemore, forming what they had decided to call a parents' delegation. Sarah Mitchum invited them in for coffee, though the tension in her kitchen could have been cut with a hay knife. Clara sat at the small table, her lesson plans spread before her, trying to project calm authority while her stomach knotted. Miss Whitmore? Henley began, settling his considerable frame into the chair across from her. We appreciate what you're trying to do for our children. We surely do. But some concerns have been raised. Clara set down her pen and folded her hands. She had expected this conversation since the vandalism began. What concerns? Well, Cobb cleared his throat. It seems like you might be pushing a bit hard, moving a bit fast. These children have never had formal schooling before. They're remarkably quick learners, Clara replied. I've been impressed by their intelligence and curiosity. That's just it, said Sizemore. You've got them asking questions that maybe don't need asking, stirring up thoughts that maybe ought to stay settled. Clara felt heat rise in her cheeks. but kept her voice level. What specific concerns do you have with the curriculum? The men exchanged glances. Henley took the lead. The war history, for one. These mountains lost good men in that fight. Families are still healing from those wounds. Maybe that's not the best place to start a child's education. History helps us understand the present, Clara said. The children should know about the events that shaped their country. Should they know their grandfathers were fighting for evil? Cobb's voice carried an edge. Should they come home thinking their people were on the wrong side? They should understand that complex issues have complex causes, Clara replied. I'm not teaching them to judge their families. I'm teaching them to think critically about difficult subjects. Sarah Mitchum refilled coffee cups, her movements careful and deliberate. Aaron Mitchum stood by the window, saying nothing but listening to every word. There's also the matter of expectations, Henley continued. You're teaching these children about places and opportunities that don't exist for mountain people. You're giving them ideas about college and city life that can only lead to disappointment. Or to achievement, Clara countered. Some of these children have exceptional potential. James could study engineering. Mary has a natural gift for languages. Timothy shows real aptitude for mathematics. Why should they be limited by geography? Because geography is what we have, Sizemore said bluntly. This hollow needs its children. The farms need workers. The mill needs hands. If you send our brightest away to the cities, what's left for us? Clara stood and walked to the window, looking out at the mist rising from Pine Creek. She had encountered this argument before, in her training and in her previous teaching position in a small town near Frankfurt. It always came down to the same conflict: individual opportunity versus community continuity. I'm not trying to empty your hollow, she said finally. I'm trying to give your children choices. Some will choose to stay and will bring new knowledge to their traditional work. Others may choose different paths, but that should be their decision to make. Made with what understanding? Henley asked. You've been here 2 weeks. You don't know what life is like through a mountain winter. You don't know what it means to lose a harvest or have the mill close for a season. You're teaching them to want things you can't deliver. The accusation stung because it contained truth. Clara had come to the hollow with genuine intentions but limited understanding. She had read about rural education but had never lived the realities these families faced daily. Then teach me, she said, turning back to face the men. Help me understand what these children need to know to thrive here. But don't ask me to limit their education because you're afraid they might leave. Aaron Mitchum finally spoke from his position by the window. What are you afraid they might find if they stay? The confrontation in the Mitchum kitchen changed the atmosphere of Pine Creek Hollow like a cold front moving through the mountains. Children who had been eager to share their school day with their families began holding back information. Parents who had been neutral about the education experiment began choosing sides. Clara noticed the shift immediately. Some of her students arrived at the Creekside classroom with the guarded expressions of children caught between competing loyalties. Others came with an almost defiant enthusiasm, as if their attendance itself had become an act of rebellion. James Henley embodied the conflict. The 16-year-old had been Clara's most promising student, quick to grasp new concepts and eager to help younger children with their lessons. But after his father's visit to the Mitchums, James became withdrawn, answering questions with reluctant monosyllables and avoiding Clara's eyes. Is everything well at home, James? Clara asked him after class on October 14th. He stood with his slate tucked under his arm, looking toward the mill where his father's saw sang through timber. Pa says I'm getting too old for schooling. Says I need to focus on learning the mill business. And what do you say? James kicked at a pine cone, sending it skittering toward the creek. I say I do what Pa decides. That's how it works in the hollow. But even as some students pulled back, others pressed forward with increased intensity. Mary Cobb continued asking questions that made her grandfather uncomfortable. The Vale children brought specimens to class that they had collected during evening chores. Mercy Cobb, the youngest student, began correcting adults when they used grammar that differed from what Miss Clara had taught her. The divide created unexpected alliances. Children from families who rarely spoke began sitting together, united by their shared experience of education. Students whose parents opposed the school began meeting secretly after chores to practice their letters and share what they remembered from lessons. Clara found herself walking a narrow path between maintaining her educational standards and avoiding further confrontation with hostile parents. She began modifying her lessons subtly, focusing more on practical skills and local knowledge while still introducing broader concepts. Today we'll practice our arithmetic by calculating board feet for the mill, she announced one morning. James, can you explain how your father determines lumber prices? The approach worked to some extent. Children who had been losing interest became engaged when lessons connected to their daily experience. Parents who had been suspicious began seeing practical value in their children's education. But the modifications came with a cost. Clara felt herself compromising the comprehensive education she had planned to provide. She was teaching these children to be more efficient workers in their hollow, rather than preparing them for opportunities beyond it. The internal conflict reached a crisis point on October 20th, when Mary Cobb approached her after class with a question that had been building for days. Miss Clara, why did you come here? Clara looked at the serious 8-year-old face and realized that her answer would reveal more than she intended. I came to teach you and the other children. But why here? Why not someplace where folks wanted a teacher? The question cut to the heart of Clara's own uncertainties. She had volunteered for the Pine Creek assignment partly from idealism and partly because no experienced teacher would take such a remote position. She had wanted to make a difference, to bring enlightenment to children who had been denied educational opportunities. But had she considered what those children and their families actually wanted? Had she asked whether her vision of education served their needs or only her own sense of purpose? I thought you deserved the same chances as children in the cities, Clara said finally. Mary nodded thoughtfully. What if we don't want the same chances? What if we want different ones? Reverend Nathaniel Pike arrived in Pine Creek Hollow on October 22nd, making his monthly circuit through the mountain settlements with his worn Bible and his weathered saddlebags. The Methodist preacher had been serving these remote communities for 15 years, and he possessed an instinct for sensing trouble that came from witnessing human nature in its mountain extremes. He found it immediately in the way families divided themselves during his evening service in Henley's mill yard. The Mitchums sat with the Vales and Dr. Frost, while the Cobbs positioned themselves near the Sizemores and other families who had grown critical of the teacher. The children sat between their parents, but their glances kept drifting toward each other across the invisible lines that had formed. Pike had heard about the schoolteacher before arriving. Word traveled fast along the mountain paths, carried by traders and mail riders who connected the scattered settlements. He knew about the state's education initiative and about the young woman from Lexington who had volunteered to bring learning to the hollow. What he sensed now was something more dangerous than simple disagreement about schooling. The hollow was fracturing along lines that could destroy the community bonds essential for mountain survival. After the service, Pike accepted Sarah Mitchum's invitation for coffee and cornbread. Clara sat at the kitchen table, still wearing the blue dress she had chosen carefully for the preacher's visit, hoping to project respectability and competence. "Miss Whitmore," Pike said, settling his angular frame into the chair across from her, "I understand you're facing some challenges with your school." Clara chose her words carefully. "Some parents have concerns about the curriculum. We're working through them." Pike studied her with eyes that had seen communities tear themselves apart over smaller issues. "In my experience, miss, educational disputes are rarely about education. They're about power, identity, and fear of change. Which of those is driving the trouble here?" The directness of the question caught Clara off guard. She had been thinking of the conflict in terms of progressive versus traditional approaches to learning, not as a fundamental challenge to community structure. "I believe," she said slowly, "that some parents fear losing their children to opportunities beyond the hollow." "And do they have reason for that fear?" Clara met the preacher's gaze. "Some of these children have exceptional potential. It would be wrong to limit them artificially." "Wrong according to whom?" Pike asked. "The state that sent you here? The college that trained you? Or the children themselves?" Before Clara could answer, Aaron Mitchum spoke from his position near the stove. "Reverend, what happens to a community that loses its young people?" Pike nodded approvingly at the question. "It dies, eventually. But what happens to young people who are denied the chance to grow?" "They grow anyway," Sarah Mitchum said quietly, "just in different directions." The conversation continued past midnight, circling around questions that had no easy answers. Pike shared stories from other mountain communities where similar conflicts had played out. Some had found ways to balance tradition with progress. Others had split apart, scattering families and destroying generations of mutual support. "The key," Pike said finally, "is whether change comes from within or is imposed from outside. People can adapt to almost anything if they feel they have some control over the process." Clara understood the implication. Her approach had been to bring predetermined educational standards to the hollow, rather than working with the community to develop a program that served their specific needs and values. "What would you suggest?" she asked. Pike stood and gathered his coat. "Ask different questions, miss. Instead of wondering how to make these children fit the world beyond the mountains, ask how education can help them improve the world they inhabit. Instead of preparing them to leave, prepare them to choose wisely whether to stay or go." As the preacher prepared to leave the next morning, he pulled Clara aside for a private word. "Be careful, miss," he said, his voice carrying a gravity that made her stomach clench. "I've seen communities handle disagreement in ways that leave permanent scars. Some of the men in this hollow fought in a war that taught them violence solves problems. Don't let pride or principle push them toward solutions that everyone will regret." Clara watched him ride away, his warning echoing in her mind as she prepared for another day of classes. But she had signed a contract with the state, and she had made promises to children who deserved better than ignorance. She would continue teaching, but she would also begin asking the different questions Pike had suggested. The first letter appeared tucked under Clara's dinner plate at the Mitchum cabin on October 24th. Written in a careful hand that disguised the author's identity, it contained a simple message. "Some learning comes too dear. Consider the price." Clara showed the note to Sarah Mitchum, who examined the paper and handwriting with concern. "I don't recognize the writing," Sarah said. "Could be any of a dozen people trying to disguise their hand." Should I be worried? Clara asked. Sarah folded the letter carefully. In the mountains, folks prefer plain speaking. When they start writing anonymous notes, it means they're considering actions they don't want to be held accountable for. The second letter arrived 2 days later, slipped under her door during the night. This one was more specific. The children belong to the hollow. Outsiders who steal them away find the mountains unforgiving. Clara felt cold despite the warmth of her room. The threat was subtle but unmistakable. She was being warned to modify her teaching or face consequences that were intentionally left undefined. She considered reporting the letters to the county sheriff, but the nearest law enforcement was 3 days' ride away, and local problems were typically handled by local people. She thought about discussing them with Dr. Frost or Reverend Pike, but both men were temporary visitors to the hollow rather than permanent residents. Instead, she decided to address the situation directly with her students. If someone was trying to intimidate her into leaving or compromising her educational standards, the children deserved to know that their schooling might be threatened. Some people in the hollow have concerns about our school, she told the 23 children gathered in the creekside clearing on October 27th. They worry that education might change you in ways that aren't helpful to your families or your community. The children listened with the serious attention they had learned to give important announcements. Several glanced toward the tree line, as if expecting to see adults watching from the shadows. I want you to know, Clara continued, that learning should make you better members of your community, not strangers to it. The goal isn't to make you dissatisfied with your home, but to help you contribute to it more effectively. Timothy Cobb raised his hand. Miss Clara, are you going to leave? The question struck at Clara's deepest fears. She had been considering exactly that possibility, wondering if her presence was causing more harm than good to the hollow's social fabric. I don't want to leave, she said honestly, but I also don't want to cause problems that hurt your families. Mary Cobb stood up, her 8-year-old frame suddenly seeming much older. What if we don't want you to go? A murmur of agreement rippled through the group. Even James Henley, who had been withdrawn since his father's confrontation with Clara, nodded his support. Then we need to find a way to make this work, Clara said. Together. The solution came from an unexpected source. Rebecca Sizemore, whose father had been among Clara's harshest critics, suggested that the school could focus more on practical skills that would benefit the hollow directly. Pa says book learning is fine if it helps with farming and business, Rebecca said. Maybe we could learn things that make the hollow better instead of learning things that make us want to leave. Clara felt a shift in her understanding of her role. Instead of bringing outside knowledge to transform the children, she could help them use education to transform their community from within. That evening, she began revising her lesson plans with input from the children themselves. They would still learn reading, writing, and arithmetic, but they would apply those skills to hollow-specific challenges. They would study natural science by examining their own ecosystem. They would learn history by researching their family's stories and the settlement of their region. The approach felt like compromise, but it also felt like wisdom. The letters keep coming. On November 1st, Thomas Henley discovered that someone had broken into his mill office and stolen the account ledger that recorded lumber sales and worker wages. Nothing else was missing. Not the cash box, not the expensive tools, not even the whiskey he kept for closing difficult deals. Just the leather-bound ledger that contained 5 years of financial records. Henley suspected vandalism by children who had learned enough arithmetic to understand how much their families were being paid for their labor. Clara's mathematics lessons had included calculating hourly wages, comparing prices across different markets, and understanding profit margins. The children now knew things about the Hollow's economy that had previously been hidden from them. "It's got to be connected to that school," Henley told the gathering of men at Cobb's post office that evening. Before she got here, nobody questioned how business was conducted. Now we've got children asking why lumber prices vary and whether wages are fair. Dr. Frost, who happened to be passing through on his monthly circuit, overheard the conversation. "Knowledge of mathematics leads to theft now?" "Knowledge of mathematics leads to dissatisfaction," Ezra Sizemore replied. "My Rebecca came home asking why other sawmills pay their workers more than Thomas does. Said she calculated it from figures Miss Clara had them practice with." "And is that calculation accurate?" Frost asked. The silence that followed provided the answer. The children's arithmetic was sound, and their conclusions were uncomfortable. Jeremiah Cobb shifted uncomfortably behind his counter. "The point isn't whether the figures are right. The point is whether children should be questioning their elders' business decisions." "Perhaps," Frost suggested, "the point is whether those business decisions can stand up to questioning." The exchange might have remained philosophical if Aaron Mitchum hadn't arrived with disturbing news. His wife Sarah had found their daughter studying the mill's ledger pages, which had mysteriously appeared in the children's outdoor classroom. "Someone left them arranged on the logs where the children sit," Mitchum reported. "Spread out like they were part of a lesson plan." Clara, who had been quietly listening from the back of the post office, stepped forward. "I didn't take the ledger, and I didn't arrange those pages for a lesson." "But you taught them how to read such documents," Henley accused. "You gave them the tools to understand what they were looking at." "I taught them arithmetic and reading," Clara replied. "What they choose to apply those skills to is beyond my control." "Is it?" Cobb asked. "You've been filling their heads with ideas about questioning authority and seeking truth. Maybe you didn't steal the ledger, but you created the thieves." The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a poorly drawing chimney. Clara felt the weight of the community's suspicion settling around her like a heavy coat. Dr. Frost cleared his throat. "Has anyone considered that the ledger might have been taken by someone who wanted to create exactly this kind of suspicion? Someone who wanted to blame the school for community problems?" The suggestion introduced a new possibility that made everyone uncomfortable. If one of the Hollow's residents was deliberately trying to discredit Clara's teaching, it meant the conflict had moved beyond honest disagreement into active sabotage. "Who would do such a thing?" Sarah Mitchum asked. "Someone who benefits from keeping the community divided," Frost replied. "Or someone who profits from maintaining the current arrangement of knowledge and power." That night, Clara lay awake in her small room, listening to the October wind rattle the cabin walls. The missing ledger felt like more than theft or vandalism. It felt like escalation in a conflict that was growing beyond her ability to control. She had come to Pine Creek Hollow to teach children how to read and write and calculate. Instead, she had apparently taught them to question, to analyze, and to recognize disparities they had never noticed before. Was that education or disruption? Was she fulfilling her mandate or destroying the community she had been sent to serve? The answers seemed as elusive as shadows moving through the mountain trees. November brought early snow to Cumberland Ridge, dusting the peaks with white that would deepen as winter settled over the hollow. Clara moved her classes into the abandoned cabin that served as the community meeting house, grateful for walls that blocked the mountain wind, but aware that the confined space intensified every conflict. The indoor setting changed the dynamics of teaching and learning. Children who had seemed comfortable in the outdoor classroom became restless and distracted. Parents who had tolerated the school when it operated at a distance now objected to their children spending hours in a building associated with community decisions and adult business. More troubling were the changes in the children themselves. The theft of Henley's ledger had divided them into factions that reflected their families' positions on the school. Some students arrived each morning with the defiant loyalty of children protecting something precious. Others came reluctantly, their enthusiasm dampened by pressure at home. James Henley stopped attending altogether after his father formally withdrew him to work full-time at the mill. The 16-year-old's absence left a void in the classroom dynamic and sent a clear message about the school's precarious position in the community. But it was the new students who worried Clara most. 3 children had joined the class since the ledger incident, siblings whose parents had previously forbidden their attendance, but now sent them with strict instructions to report everything the teacher said and did. "Pa wants to know what you're teaching about the war," announced 12-year-old Marcus Sizemore during a history lesson. "Says I should pay special attention to anything that makes our people sound bad." Clara realized she was being watched and tested by parents who had moved beyond mere skepticism to active surveillance. Every word she spoke was potential evidence in an undeclared trial. She adapted by involving the children more directly in shaping their lessons. Instead of lecturing about the Civil War, she had them interview their grandparents about their memories and experiences. Rather than teaching abstract mathematics, she had them solve practical problems facing the hollow, calculating seed requirements, estimating lumber yields, determining fair wages. The approach worked to some extent. Children became enthusiastic about learning when it connected directly to their lives and families. Parents found it harder to object to lessons that honored local knowledge and experience, but Clara sensed that her modifications weren't addressing the deeper issues driving the conflict. The anonymous letters continued arriving, now accompanied by more pointed warnings. Some mistakes can't be undone. The hollow takes care of its own problems. Outsiders who overstay their welcome find the mountains unwelcoming. Dr. Frost, during his November visit, noticed the tension immediately. "The atmosphere has changed since last month," he told Clara privately. "People are choosing sides in ways that could tear this community apart." "What should I do?" Clara asked. "I've tried to address their concerns, but nothing seems sufficient." Frost considered the question while gazing out at the snow-covered ridges. "You're dealing with more than educational philosophy," he said finally. "You're threatening a social order that has kept this community stable for generations. Some people will fight to preserve that order, regardless of the cost." "Are you saying I should leave?" "I'm saying you should be very careful about how this plays out. Mountain feuds have started over smaller disagreements than this one." That evening, Clara sat in the Mitchum kitchen trying to grade arithmetic papers by lamplight while Sarah prepared supper. The domestic routine felt comforting after the day's tensions, but even here the conflict intruded. "Aaron thinks we should send you back to Lexington before someone gets hurt," Sarah said quietly. Clara looked up from the papers. "Do you agree?" Sarah stirred the pot of beans, her movements deliberate and thoughtful. "I think these children deserve every opportunity you can give them. I also think some folks in this hollow would rather destroy the school than see it change their way of life. What would you do in my position?" Sarah set down her spoon and faced Clara directly. "I'd ask myself whether I was helping these children or using them to prove a point about education, and I'd be very careful about the answer." Clara woke to the sound of boots on the cabin porch and low voices conferring in the November darkness. The clock on Sarah Mitchum's mantel showed 2:15 a.m. when the soft knock came at the door. Aaron Mitchum answered, in his nightclothes, shotgun in hand, but pointed toward the floor. 3 men stood in the lamplight: Thomas Henley, Ezra Sizemore, and a figure Clara didn't immediately recognize. Their faces carried the gravity of men who had been debating a serious decision. "We need to speak with Miss Whitmore," Henley said quietly. "It's important." Sarah appeared at Clara's shoulder as she emerged from her small room, hastily dressed and thoroughly awake. The presence of armed men at their door in the middle of the night suggested that the conflict over the school had reached a new level of seriousness. "What's this about?" Aaron asked. The third man stepped forward, and Clara recognized him as Samuel Cobb, Jeremiah's older brother who lived up the ridge and rarely came to the post office gatherings. His presence indicated that opposition to the school had spread beyond the immediate families. "There's been a development," Samuel said. "Something that changes the situation." He reached into his coat and withdrew a bundle of papers tied with string. Even in the lamplight, Clara could see the official seal of the Kentucky Department of Education. "Mail rider brought these today," Samuel continued. "Seems the state has been getting reports about the school, about problems with community acceptance and educational disruption." Clara felt her stomach drop. Someone had been writing to her supervisors in Frankfurt, providing their version of events in Pine Creek Hollow. Henley took the papers and untied the string. "They're sending an inspector next week to evaluate the program. Says here they've received complaints about inappropriate curriculum and community resistance." "What kind of complaints?" Clara asked, though she suspected she knew. "The kind that could end your teaching career," Sizemore said bluntly. "Accusations of promoting social discord, disrespecting local customs, and exceeding your authority as a rural instructor." Clara reached for the papers, scanning the formal language that reduced months of complex community interaction to bureaucratic charges. The accusations were carefully worded to sound professional, while painting her as an incompetent troublemaker. "Who filed these complaints?" she asked. The men exchanged glances. "Does it matter?" Henley asked. "The inspector's coming either way." But it did matter, because it revealed how far some community members were willing to go to end her influence. Filing formal complaints with the state was a serious escalation that could affect not just Clara's position, but the future of education programs in similar mountain communities. "We came to give you a chance," Samuel said. "You could leave before the inspector arrives. Tell them you decided the position wasn't a good fit. No one gets hurt professionally, and the Hollow goes back to handling its own affairs." Clara looked at the 3 men, then at Aaron and Sarah Mitchum, whose faces showed their own conflict between personal loyalty and community peace. "And if I stay?" "Then you face whatever the inspector decides," Henley said. "But you also face whatever this community decides about outsiders who won't take good advice." The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Clara's safety would no longer be guaranteed if she chose to fight the complaints and continue teaching. "I need time to consider," Clara said. "You have until Sunday," Samuel replied. "After that, events will take their own course." The men filed out into the November night, leaving Clara and the Mitchums to contemplate what had just occurred. The conflict had moved beyond educational philosophy into something that resembled a small-scale war between competing visions of the Hollow's future. "What will you do?" Sarah asked. Clara looked at the official papers, with their formal accusations and bureaucratic language. She thought about the children who had entrusted her with their education and about the promises she had made to expand their opportunities. She also thought about the reality that her presence was dividing families and threatening the social bonds that held the mountain community together. "I don't know," she said honestly, "but I have until Sunday to decide." Word of the midnight visit spread through Pine Creek Hollow faster than smoke from a chimney fire. By Friday morning, November 9th, everyone knew that Clara faced an ultimatum: leave voluntarily or face both a state investigation and escalating community pressure. The children arrived at the meeting house classroom with expressions that revealed how much they had overheard at home. Some looked defiant, others worried, and a few appeared resigned to losing something they had come to value. Clara had spent 2 sleepless nights deciding how to handle what might be her final days as their teacher. She could use the time to prepare them for her potential departure, or she could continue teaching as if nothing had changed. Neither option felt adequate to the situation. "I need to tell you something important," she said after the morning recitation. "Some adults in the Hollow have asked the state to send someone to evaluate our school. Depending on what that person decides, I might not be able to continue as your teacher." 20 hands shot up with questions, but Clara held up her palm for silence. "Before you ask anything, I want you to know that this situation isn't your fault. Adults sometimes disagree about what's best for children, and sometimes those disagreements become serious conflicts." Mary Cobb stood without being recognized. "What do you want us to do?" The question cut to the heart of Clara's dilemma. She could encourage the children to support her position, potentially putting them at odds with their families. She could tell them to accept whatever the adults decided, essentially abandoning her educational mission. Or she could help them think through the situation independently, which might be the most dangerous option of all. "I want you to think about what education means to you," Clara said carefully. "Not what your parents think it should mean, or what I think it should mean, but what you think it should mean." Rebecca Sizemore raised her hand. "What if we think different things?" "Then you think different things," Clara replied. "That's your right as individuals." Timothy Cobb stood up, his 10-year-old face serious beyond his years. "Miss Clara, what happens if we want you to stay but our families want you to go?" The question articulated the impossible position the children faced: loyalty to their teacher and their education versus loyalty to their families and community. "That's a choice each of you will have to make," Clara said. "But remember that families are permanent and teachers are temporary. Whatever you decide, you'll need to live with your choice long after I'm gone." The conversation that followed revealed the depth of the children's engagement with their own education. They had learned more than reading and arithmetic during their months with Clara. They had learned to question, to analyze, and to think independently about complex issues. Some argued passionately for continuing the school regardless of adult opposition. Others worried about the community division their education was causing. A few suggested modifications that might satisfy both their desire to learn and their families' concerns. But it was James Henley's unexpected appearance that changed the dynamic completely. The 16-year-old entered the classroom during their discussion, still wearing his work clothes from the mill. "I heard about the inspector," he said to Clara. "Pa doesn't know I'm here, but I wanted to say something." He faced his former classmates, his presence commanding their attention in ways that Clara's authority could not. "You're lucky to have what she's trying to give you," James said. "I've been working at the mill full-time since October, and I can see things now that I couldn't see before. The way we live doesn't have to be the only way we live. The work we do doesn't have to be the only work we can do." He paused, looking directly at Clara. "That doesn't mean we have to leave the hollow or forget our families. It means we can choose what's best for ourselves based on real understanding instead of just doing what we've always done." James turned back to the children. "Whatever happens with the inspector, don't let anyone convince you that ignorance is better than knowledge. And don't let anyone tell you that loyalty means refusing to think for yourself." He left as suddenly as he had arrived, returning to work before his absence could be discovered. But his words lingered in the classroom like morning mist, clarifying issues that had been obscured by adult politics and community pressure. Clara realized that her students had already made their choice. They wanted to continue learning, regardless of the costs or complications. The question was whether she was brave enough to honor their choice. The discovery came by accident on Saturday afternoon, November 10th, when Timothy Cobb was helping his grandfather organize old correspondence in the post office. Hidden behind a stack of seed catalogs, Timothy found a folder containing drafts of the letters that had been sent to the Kentucky Department of Education. The handwriting was unmistakably Jeremiah Cobb's. Timothy stared at the papers, reading accusations against Miss Clara written in his grandfather's careful script. The charges were detailed and damning, promoting social discord, disrespecting local customs, encouraging children to question parental authority, and creating divisions within a previously harmonious community. But what shocked Timothy most was the date on the earliest draft, September 28th, the same day Clara's appointment letter had arrived. His grandfather had been planning to discredit the teacher before she had even reached Pine Creek Hollow. The 10-year-old faced a choice that would have challenged an adult: protect his family by keeping the discovery secret, or reveal evidence that could change the entire conflict's trajectory. Timothy chose truth. He arrived at the Mitchum cabin as Clara was preparing her final lesson plans, uncertain whether she would be teaching on Monday or packing for departure. The boy's serious expression and the folder clutched in his small hands immediately captured her attention. "Miss Clara," Timothy said, "I think you need to see these." Clara read through the drafts with growing amazement and anger. The letters revealed not just opposition to her teaching, but a coordinated campaign to ensure her failure. Jeremiah Cobb had contacted the state education department before Clara had taught a single lesson, predicting problems that he had then worked to create. "Does your grandfather know you found these?" Clara asked. Timothy shook his head. "I brought them straight here, but he'll notice they're missing when he looks for them." Sarah and Aaron Mitchum read the papers with expressions of disgust and disbelief. The evidence revealed that the community conflict they had all experienced was not the natural result of educational disagreement, but the orchestrated outcome of one man's determination to prevent change. "This changes everything," Aaron said. "If people knew that Jeremiah had decided to drive you out before you even arrived, they might see the whole situation differently." Clara felt a mixture of vindication and sadness. The letters proved that she had been fighting an impossible battle from the beginning, but they also revealed how deeply one person's fear of change could divide an entire community. "What should we do with this evidence?" Clara asked. Before anyone could answer, boots sounded on the porch, and Jeremiah Cobb's voice called out urgently. "Aaron, Sarah, I need to speak with you about Timothy." The boy had been discovered missing from the post office, and his grandfather had traced him to the Mitchum cabin. Clara quickly hid the folder as Cobb entered, without waiting for permission. "Timothy," the old man said, his voice carrying both relief and suspicion. "What are you doing here so late?" The boy looked at Clara, then at his grandfather. weighing loyalties that should never have been placed on such young shoulders. "I was returning something to Miss Clara," Timothy said carefully. "Something that belonged to her." Cobb's eyes narrowed as he noticed Clara's tense expression and the Mitchum's obvious discomfort. "What kind of something?" Clara made the decision for all of them. She retrieved the folder and handed it to Cobb, meeting his gaze directly. "Letters," she said. "Apparently some people in this hollow have been more concerned with political maneuvering than with children's education." Cobb opened the folder and saw his own handwriting staring back at him. For a moment, his face showed the shock of a man whose secret calculations had been exposed. Then his expression hardened into the defensive anger of someone who felt cornered. "Those are private correspondence," he said. "You had no right to take them." "I didn't take them," Clara replied. "Your grandson found them and brought them to me because he thought I should know why this community has been so hostile to education." Timothy stepped forward, his small frame somehow managing to project courage in the face of his grandfather's anger. "Grandpappy, why did you decide Miss Clara was bad before you even met her?" The question hung in the lamp-lit kitchen like an accusation that demanded an answer. Jeremiah Cobb looked at his grandson, then at the adults who were waiting for his response. "Because," he said finally, "some changes are too dangerous to allow, even if they seem beneficial at first." Sunday, November 11th, dawned clear and cold, with frost painting the windows of the meeting house, where Clara had taught her final official lesson. The state inspector was expected Monday afternoon, and the community had spent the weekend in tense preparation for what many assumed would be the school's last day. Clara rose early, determined to use whatever time remained to complete one final project with her students. She had planned a special lesson that would demonstrate everything they had learned. A presentation about Pine Creek Hollow's history, geography, and natural resources that combined all their academic skills with their local knowledge. She gathered her materials, the slate boards, chalk, reference books, and specimens the children had collected, and walked through the morning mist to the creekside clearing where she had first taught them. The outdoor classroom seemed appropriate for this concluding session, a return to the place where their educational journey had begun. The children arrived throughout the morning, some bringing parents who wanted to witness what might be Clara's final lesson. Even families who had opposed the school came to see how the experiment would end. Thomas Henley appeared with James, whose presence defied his father's earlier prohibition. Dr. Frost rode in from his circuit, having heard about the inspector's pending visit. Clara organized the children into groups, each responsible for presenting one aspect of their community study. Mary Cobb's group had researched the geological formation of the hollow, learning to identify rock types and understand how the landscape had been shaped. Timothy Cobb's team had calculated the economic impact of various local industries, from timber to small-scale farming. Rebecca Sizemore's group had collected oral histories from their grandparents, documenting settlement stories and family traditions. As the presentations unfolded, something remarkable happened. The adults began to see their familiar hollow through new eyes, understanding geological processes that had shaped their land, recognizing economic patterns that affected their livelihoods, and hearing family stories preserved and organized in ways that gave them new meaning. "I never knew the creek changed course 3 times in the last century," said Martha Vale, listening to her son explain erosion patterns. "These children know more about timber pricing than most of the men at the mill," Thomas Henley admitted grudgingly. But it was the final presentation that truly captured everyone's attention. James Henley had prepared a summary of what education had meant to the children themselves, based on interviews he had conducted with his former classmates. "Learning didn't make us ashamed of the hollow," James said, facing the assembled adults. "It made us understand how special this place is. We learned that our family's stories matter enough to be preserved carefully. We learned that our natural resources are valuable enough to be managed wisely. We learned that our community is strong enough to adapt and grow." He paused, looking directly at his father. "Most importantly, we learned that choosing to stay or choosing to leave are both valid decisions, but they should be decisions based on understanding rather than ignorance." The crowd listened in thoughtful silence as James concluded his presentation. Clara felt a surge of pride in her students' growth and a deep sadness that their educational journey was likely ending just as they were beginning to understand its potential. As the formal presentations concluded and families began to disperse, Clara noticed that several children remained in the clearing, reluctant to leave what had become their special place. They gathered around her with questions about the next day's inspection and concerns about the school's future. "Will you really have to go away?" asked Mercy Cobb, the youngest student. "I don't know," Clara answered honestly. "That depends on what the inspector decides and what your community chooses." Mary Cobb tugged at Clara's sleeve. "Miss Clara, can we show you something? Something special we found in the woods?" Clara looked at the group of children. Mary, Timothy, Rebecca, Mercy, and several others, their faces bright with excitement, despite the day's emotional weight. "Of course," Clara said. "Lead the way." The children guided her away from the clearing, following a path that led deeper into the woods than Clara had ever ventured. They walked for several minutes, chattering about their discovery and its significance, though Clara couldn't quite follow their explanations. "It's just a little further," Mary called back. "You're going to love this, Miss Clara." Clara followed trustingly, her attention focused on the children's enthusiasm rather than the deepening shadows of the forest around them. Behind them, the voices of parents and other adults grew fainter as the group moved further from the creekside clearing. It was the last time anyone in Pine Creek Hollow would see Clara Whitmore alive. When the children returned to the clearing without their teacher, they brought a story that made no sense to the adults who heard it. Miss Clara had stopped walking, they said, and had stood perfectly still in the middle of the forest path. She had been looking at something deeper in the woods that none of them could see. She just put down her books and walked into the trees. Mary Cobb told her grandfather, her 8-year-old face serious and confused. "We called after her, but she didn't turn around. She just kept walking until we couldn't see her anymore." The children had waited for nearly an hour, they claimed, expecting Clara to return from whatever had captured her attention. When she didn't come back, they had gathered her abandoned materials and returned to find the adults. Thomas Henley organized the first search party before sunset, leading a group of men into the woods along the path the children had described. They found Clara's books and teaching materials scattered along the trail exactly where the children had said they would be, but no sign of the teacher herself. The searchers called Clara's name until their voices echoed off the ridge walls, but heard no response. They followed every game trail and deer path that branched from the main route, looking for footprints or torn fabric or any indication of where she might have gone. As darkness fell, they returned to the hollow with growing concern. A healthy young woman doesn't simply vanish in woods that the local men had known since childhood. There should have been tracks, signs of struggle, or evidence of accident. Dr. Frost examined the abandoned materials by lamplight, looking for clues that might explain Clara's disappearance. Her books showed no signs of violence. Her slate board was undamaged, Even her coat lay neatly folded beside the path, as if she had removed it deliberately before continuing deeper into the forest. "The children's story doesn't make sense," Frost told the assembled men. "People don't just abandon their possessions and walk into the wilderness without reason, and unless they weren't in their right mind," suggested Ezra Sizemore. "The pressure from the community, the inspector coming, the conflict over the school. Maybe it was too much for her." Aaron Mitchum shook his head. Clara wasn't the type to break under pressure. She was stubborn, but she was stable. The search resumed at dawn on Monday, with teams of men combing every ravine and ridge within miles of the last sighting. They found deer trails, bear sign, and the remains of old logging camps, but nothing that belonged to Clara Whitmore. Jeremiah Cobb questioned his grandson and the other children repeatedly, searching for details they might have forgotten or overlooked. But their story remained consistent. Miss Clara had stopped, looked into the woods, set down her belongings, and walked away without explanation. "Did she say anything?" Cobb asked. "Did she seem frightened or upset?" "She seemed like she was listening to something," Timothy replied. "But we couldn't hear anything except the normal forest sounds." The state inspector arrived Monday afternoon to find Pine Creek Hollow focused entirely on the missing teacher rather than on educational evaluation. Inspector Harrison Davis, a methodical man from Frankfurt, quickly realized that his planned assessment would have to wait until the crisis was resolved. Davis interviewed the children himself, bringing professional experience in questioning witnesses. But their account never varied in its essential details, even when he pressed them for additional information. "Either these children are extraordinarily good liars," Davis told Dr. Frost privately, "or something very unusual happened in those woods." The search continued for 5 days, with volunteer searchers coming from neighboring hollows to help. They explored caves, examined cliffs, and dragged the deeper pools of Pine Creek. They followed every lead and investigated every theory, from accidental death to deliberate disappearance. They found nothing. On Saturday, November 17th, the search was officially suspended. Clara Whitmore had vanished as completely as if the earth had opened and swallowed her. Inspector Davis submitted his report to the Kentucky Department of Education 3 weeks after Clara's disappearance. The document noted that the Pine Creek Hollow educational experiment had been terminated due to the teacher's unexplained absence and recommended against future attempts to establish schools in communities with demonstrated resistance to outside intervention. The children returned to their previous routines, but they carried the knowledge Clara had given them throughout their lives. James Henley eventually left the Hollow to study engineering, becoming the first college graduate in his family's history. Mary Cobb grew up to become a teacher herself, bringing education to mountain communities with a sensitivity Clara had never quite achieved. Timothy Cobb inherited his grandfather's post office and used his mathematical skills to help neighbors with business correspondence and legal documents. Some families moved away from Pine Creek Hollow in the years following Clara's disappearance, unable to shake the feeling that something dark and inexplicable had touched their community. Others stayed and thrived, grateful that the divisive conflict over education had ended, even if the resolution remained mysterious. Thomas Henley's mill prospered for another generation before closing due to depleted timber resources. Jeremiah Cobb's post office operated until the railroad finally reached the Hollow in 1908. Dr. Frost continued his circuit for 15 more years, but he never forgot the young teacher who had vanished without explanation. The meeting house where Clara had taught her final lessons was eventually torn down and its lumber used for barn repairs. The creekside clearing where she had held her first classes grew wild with honeysuckle and mayapple, erasing the physical traces of the educational experiment. But the story persisted in the oral tradition of Pine Creek Hollow, passed down through generations with the embellishments and modifications that time brings to unexplained events. Some versions claimed Clara had been murdered by opponents of her school and her body hidden in a deep cave. Others suggested she had suffered a mental breakdown and wandered off to die in the wilderness. A few maintained that she had staged her own disappearance to escape an impossible situation. The children who had been with her that final day grew old and died, but they never changed their account of what they had witnessed. Miss Clara had simply looked into the woods, set down her books, and walked away from everything she had worked to build. The legend endures that on clear November mornings, when the mist rises from Pine Creek and drifts through the hollow, you can sometimes see a figure moving among the trees, a young woman in a blue dress, still searching for something she lost in the forest shadows over a century ago. Subscribe if you want the next deep dive.